This program is brought to you by Grand Valley State University.
What makes a leader a statesman? This is a question that we ask all the time at the Hauenstein Center. And one of the best answers we've gotten was from Professor J. Rufus Fears, who is a noted historian, notable historian, professor of the classics, and one of our great friends. But he told us that there are 4 qualities that distinguish statesmen. One is a bedrock of principles upon which everything is built. 2 is a moral compass that guides us through the complex and conflicting issues we face every day. 3 is a vision that guides the communities of people that we intend to lead. And 4 is a talent for achieving consensus around that vision. But you notice the first 2 are very much relevant to what we're talking about. First principles, a moral compass. And Fears applies this definition widely to leaders like Jefferson and Lincoln and Gandhi and Thatcher. We had an example in our readings this month, John Adams, whose rootedness in principles led him to defend in court British soldiers at great risk to himself in the midst of the Boston Massacre. It led him to champion American independence before that was widely popular, and it led him to a lifetime of public service. Well, we can all look forward to an invigorating talk today by our guest, Mrs. Annette Kirk, that will remind us of the enormous importance of those first principles. But first, I'd like to start by recognizing members of our Hauenstein Center Advisory Cabinet with us today. If you could please stand and be recognized. All of our cabinet members who are in the middle of chewing. Taylor Snell is the chairman of that group, and he and his colleagues are working very hard with our staff to make your Leadership Fellows experience better and better. I would also like to briefly single out John Wardrop. John, where are you in the room? John, if you could stand for just a moment longer. As you take another bite. Last month we recognized our 5 students who were awarded named fellowships this year. Megan, Selma, Jim, Allie, and Petra. It's important that we also recognize John and his family. John's name graces Petra's fellowship, the John Wardrop Leadership Fellow. And it's the generosity and counsel of people like John that make everything we do possible. And so I want to recognize that as often as possible. Thank you, John. Finally, I'll finish with one housekeeping item. We are in the midst of recruiting for next year's Leadership Fellows, and we have lots of faculty and staff members here at the university chipping in, sending us names, getting word out, and we're getting a lot of applications. But I want to make sure I give you your chance, because a lot of you came to us by word of mouth from other fellows. And so we have a legal pad out front again. On your way out, if anybody comes to mind, write down a name, and we'll get in contact, because we want to make sure we always have a great and cohesive group, and it's important that we get your feedback on that. At this time, I would like to welcome Hauenstein Center Director GLEAVES Whitney up to the podium to introduce today's guest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian. Well, the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies is delighted and honored to host my dear friend, Annette Kirk. Here's some highlights from her very interesting life. Annette initially met her future husband, Russell Kirk, when she was an undergrad, and he, a famous author, about 21 years her senior. Their courtship included engaging letter exchanges in which they debated and discussed all sorts of topics: religion, history, current events, political philosophy, and of course marriage. At one point, Annette wrote Russell, "You know, our marriage is inevitable." To which he replied, "Yes, inevitable, like death and taxes." Well, their union was inevitable, and for 3 decades the Kirks lived about an hour north of here in Mecosta, raised 4 beautiful, talented daughters, and established their home as the 20th century equivalent of a salon to which scholars, journalists, and writers from around the world came. They were drawn there for the engagement and the conversation, brilliant, sparkling conversation. All the while, Annette provided an environment in which Russell could apply his talents as an independent man of letters producing numerous books and articles and lectures, also a number of columns. After Russell passed away in 1994, Annette founded the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal, of which she is president. Over the past 16 years, she has devoted her considerable energy to keeping Russell Kirk's work and ideas alive in public discourse. During that time, she has become known as the Grande Dame of the Russell Kirk Center, or, in light of her irrepressible energy, the Grand Dame. In the early 1980s, President Ronald Reagan appointed Annette to the National Commission on Excellence in Education, which in 1983 published a landmark study, A Nation at Risk, elevating educational issues to national prominence. Since then, Annette has encouraged our educational and political leaders to consider to what purpose we are educating our youth, and whether true education can exist without some moral dimension, some of the things Brian mentioned in the Rufus Fears part of his introduction. Annette received her bachelor's degree and an honorary Doctor of Letters from Malloy College. She taught English and drama in New York Public High School there, and she did graduate work at Columbia University. Now, off the formal biography, let me say this. I can tell you that there are many wonderful ways to get to know Annette Kirk. You can read about her in Russell Kirk's autobiography, The Sword of Imagination. Maybe she will tell you maybe about the time that she was in the Oval Office with President Nixon and said something that he certainly would not have been happy to hear. She's also featured in several of Russell's short stories, one of which tells of when she was kidnapped. True story. Better, you can go to one of the many seminars she hosts up in Mecosta. And you know, if you're a student, and if you're lucky, you may get to know her as a mentor. Annette has mentored numerous undergrads and grad students over the years, and I've told her, when I've seen the impact she has had on so many, that she's an angel dressed up like a human. Truly, she is a gift to those of us who've known her. Ladies and gentlemen, Annette Kirk.
Thank you very much, Gleaves. That was, as usual, he's a wordsmith. It was wonderful, his rhetoric. Now comes the reality. I had to have to live up to that type of introduction. I can tell you those stories afterward, though, about the White House and about being kidnapped. That might be kind of more interesting than my talk, even. Well, today I'd like to speak to you on first principles and leadership. A premise on which we can all agree is that leaders determine the course of events in history, and their decisions affect the world in which we live. One might cite great figures from the world of politics, religion, economics, or industry to illustrate how our lives have been affected by their decisions. But for the visionary leaders, the founders of Grand Valley State University, we might not be here today. But for the creative leadership of the many philanthropists of Grand Rapids, we might not have the pleasure of living in a city that continues to delight and energize us all. On a personal note, but for the presence of a writer at a lecture like this many years ago, and you already gave away my punchline, but you can appreciate this, but for the presence of that writer at a lecture like this, I would not be here today, and therein lies a tale. In Life with Russell Kirk, a lecture that I gave at the Heritage Foundation the year after Russell died in 1994, there's a sentence that says, "We are but dwarfs sitting on the shoulders of giants who provided the philosophical underpinnings of our present political discourse." During the 3 decades I was married to Russell Kirk, I was privileged to not only live with a giant who thought he was a dwarf sitting on the shoulders of yet bigger giants, but to associate with men and women who were viewed as giants because of their civic, their scholarly, or business achievements. From them, I learned how leaders act or react when under fire, and was able to observe how the professional and personal skills they brought to their work helped them when they needed to draw upon these skills rather than upon their quick wit. But back to the tale of how a presence of a writer at a lecture many years ago brought me here today. On a snowy day in February, I spoke at a conference in Manhattan on a book entitled The American Cause. And at the luncheon was seated next to the author, Russell Kirk, whom I found to be charming and shy. And by dessert, however, we discovered that we were kindred spirits. That meeting, which determined the course of my life, took place just 50 years ago, last Saturday, February 27, 1960. Thus, it seems appropriate that I am today speaking with students as on that occasion, I was a student, a junior in college, with my whole life ahead of me as yours is ahead of you now. What you do with these precious years of learning will also determine the path your life takes. So be sure to take time to reflect, not only on what you want to do, your career, but on the type of person you want to be. A young man once asked Russell the question, "Dr. Kirk, you and Mrs. Kirk are very different people. Mrs. Kirk is very energetic, always on the go and outgoing. You, on the other hand, are more meditative, stoical, and reserved. How is it that you have such a happy marriage?" Russell replied in his typical manner, without hesitation and to the point, "First principles. That is the basis of our happiness." Needless to say, the young man was startled to receive such a direct and encapsulated answer. What then are these first principles that Russell referred to, upon which we agreed? Principles upon which we based our actions and attitudes, and that we believed needed to be transmitted to the future generations for the benefit of society. From Edmund Burke, whom we both had read and appreciated, we learned that there is an eternal contract between those who have died, those who are living, and those who are yet to come. This contract is not a legalistic understanding of what we are, or what we are due, but more of a compact with those who pass on life's lessons to us. Russell and I discovered that we both hope to inspire the young to appreciate the ancient ends of education, described by Plato as the acquiring of wisdom and virtue. If these ends were nurtured in the lives of students, we believe that communities of character would result, helping to counter the level of violence then rampant in the schools and in society. This is in the 60s. From classical times until early in the last century, the importance of making wise decisions and of leading virtuous lives was a prominent theme in the primers from which all children learned their ABCs. From the 5th century BC down to the middle of the last century, the word virtue carried with it a strong suggestion of public leadership. It was believed that the truly virtuous man would assume public duties and was a person in whom self-restraint and just dealing were conspicuous. When restoring a one-room schoolhouse in our local county park, I was amazed to see the level of the literature in the early primers. Myths, legends, and tales of ancient times were read by 7- and 8-year-olds. Reading at that time, actually, not only just reading, but reading this type of literature. Such images rooted them in first principles or convictions that usually stayed with them for life and helped determine the kind of people they became. Such learning encouraged them to rise above the ordinary and to become leaders in their communities. In an article on virtue, families, and citizenship, the Harvard law professor Mary Ann Glendon writes, "Our American founders seem to have taken the moral and intellectual state of the American people for granted. James Madison said as much in Federalist Number 55, where he wrote that Republican government presupposes the existence of civic virtue to a greater degree than any other government form, and expressed his complete confidence that the political character of the American people was equal to the challenge." This confident assumption by the founders that our reserves of social capital were in excellent condition should not surprise us. Living in a country dotted with family farms and businesses, with most of the population clustered in tight-knot governing communities, how could they have foreseen that individuals in the future would depend much less on their families and more on their own wage labor or government for economic security? The founders knew, to be sure, that a good legal framework was not enough. This is evident from the many allusions made by founders Adams, Jefferson, and Madison to the importance of civic wisdom and virtue. But it seems not to have occurred to our early statesmen that the seedbeds of virtue would need tending. The social environment was there, like the natural environment. In both respects, we seemed endowed with inexhaustible riches. What now, however, is the state of our social environment more than 200 years later? Do we still think of transmitting a body of knowledge to each generation in order to ensure a common culture? Or are we so concerned with emphasizing our differences that we have neglected to transmit our commonality, which binds us together as a people and as a nation? Recent studies have shown that one of the most neglected disciplines in our high schools is the study of history, having been replaced by the social studies curriculum, often referred to as social stew, as it can include topics from anthropology, psychology, sociology, and whatever else can fit into the curriculum. Previously, history and geography were emphasized, and topics taught in those classes included the history of our country and of other cultures, as well as the need for public order, duties to the community, and the civic virtues. If history is not given its essential place in the curriculum, and historic figures are merely mentioned in a paragraph in a textbook, knowledge of the past is denied to the next generation, and human beings, in Burke's phrase, become as flies of a summer, generation failing to link with generation. What then happens to a country's culture if its young are not bound together by an historical consciousness that makes them aware that they are part of a great continuity, possessed of both rights and duties? What first principles will these future leaders hold? The concern that the schools were in need of reform so that the cafeteria-style curriculum, then current, could be replaced with a core curriculum was the reason a group on which I served during the Reagan years was formed. The National Commission on Excellence in Education consisted of 18 members and reflected a wide spectrum of the public, including teachers, scientists, university presidents, and governors. The report we issued, A Nation at Risk, just a small report, 36 pages, unlike most government reports, which is why it was so popular. That's a story in itself, how that came about. The report we issued, A Nation at Risk, found that students seemed brighter because they had grown up with television and had traveled. Yet they possessed shorter attention spans than in previous years, were accustomed to higher levels of stimulation, had fewer heroes, and showed less appetite for systematic learning. That hasn't changed very much, I'm afraid. One of the Commission's most significant findings was that as a country, we were losing our shared vision of America. The report stated, "Our concern goes well beyond matters such as industry and commerce. It also includes the intellectual, moral, and spiritual strengths of our people, which knit together the very fabric of our society." At our first meeting at the White House in October 1981, a long time ago now, President Reagan asked the Commission to consider, along with many concerns for the academic and even for the safety of students in schools, to consider the moral education of our nation's youth and to examine what could be done to improve it. A subcommittee was established, and I was appointed to that subcommittee. To give you an insight into the impossibility of our task, let me quote a wry comment made by one of our members at our first meeting. He said, "I suppose if we took a vote on the 10 Commandments, we might get agreement on about 5. However, during our deliberations, we were able to agree that a school, consciously or not, does impart habits and belief. What is the point, after all, our commission concluded, of getting 100% on an exam on which one has cheated?" The committee found that the best source for the teaching of norms or standards by which to live could be found in the appendix to a small book by C.S. Lewis, The Abolition of Man. We looked everywhere to find where we could get something that would appeal to everybody and we could issue for the public schools. There one can find historic examples of such teaching from the Hebraic Decalogue, the Chinese Tao, the Quran, and the Sermon on the Mount. These writings have provided the first principles upon which most people have acted for centuries. Now, more than 3 decades later, I can reveal how 3 of us on the commission, the vice chairman, a former governor, and I, determined to deliver one of the key components of President Reagan's educational platform, not because we were trying to be partisan, but because we truly believed in its merit. Many commissioners were lukewarm about the administration's recommendation of a program of tuition tax credits and vouchers that would allow parents to send their children to non-public or independent schools. Charter schools were then not even on the horizon. And homeschooling was still considered illegal. So we've come a long way since 1981 and 83 when the report was actually issued. When it became apparent that we would not be able to convince the Commission to adopt a recommendation supporting tax credits and vouchers, an administration spokesman suggested that we resign from the Commission at a press conference to denounce its work. We argued against this tactic and said that we thought it was still possible to insert a statement in the report that would imply the policy. We then turned our efforts toward trying to obtain a seemingly less controversial recommendation, one that emphasized that parents are the first educators of the children and that they have a right and responsibility to participate in their education. As this recommendation was seen as a non-threatening proposal, it was quickly and easily adopted. Some days before the report was scheduled to be announced, we alerted staff at the White House to the paragraph about parents as the primary educators of their children and suggested that the President might make reference to it in his remarks at the press conference announcing its publication, which by now had become something eagerly awaited by the press and the public. There was lots of excitement at that time what we were going to say, because the commission was not technically a Reagan commission. It was the Secretary of Education, Terrell Bell's commission. And Reagan was wary about actually what the findings were going to be. That's another story. On the day of the release of the report at a gathering held in the East Room of the White House, President Reagan acknowledged many of the report's findings and recommendations, and ended his remarks by reading our paragraph on parental rights and duties, concluding with the statement, "So I will continue to propose to Congress a policy of tuition tax credits and vouchers," to the pleasure of those who supported allowing parents to choose the schools that their children attend, and the consternation of members of the Commission who did not favor this policy. Suddenly they realized what we had done. From this experience, I learned that one must choose one's stands prudently and determine when one might better obtain a principle, if not a policy, but a principle from which the policy might be inferred. A Nation at Risk was more widely disseminated than any other national report, and it was followed by 30 other national reports and 300 state reports. For the next several years, when speaking at forums throughout the country on the report, I was able to comment on reforms that still needed to be implemented and to endorse tax credits and vouchers as one way of bringing about educational reform. If I had resigned, the 3 of us had resigned from that commission, we would not have had that opportunity to do that. Among those reforms still needing to be discussed, however, is that at the college and university level of learning, there must exist an idea of what education is ultimately all about, beyond providing capable workers to enable the United States to compete better in industry, trade, or commerce, and beyond training people for jobs. It seems particularly important in our technology-oriented society, when the multitude of facts threatens to overwhelm us, and when it is difficult to distinguish the timely from the trivial, that we develop leaders with a philosophical habit of mind, who take long views, who possess a sense of history, and who care about our moral inheritance. In attempting to regain consensus on first principles and a sense of community as a people, we might recall the words of Cicero describing how the neglect of an inheritance can lead to its dissolution. Of the Roman Republic, Cicero wrote, "Our age inherited the Republic like some beautiful painting of bygone days, its colors already fading through great age. And not only has our time neglected to freshen the colors of the picture, but we have failed to preserve its form and outline." Thus, the work of restoring and preserving the American civil social order is not the work of one leader only, but of many generations of leaders. All of us, then, must become leaders and do our part if we are to preserve our inheritance, indeed, our very civilization. Thank you very much. Now I invite your questions and answers and answers. I'm supposed to have the answers, but I think you have some of them too because you're budding leaders here. And then I would like to have GLEAVES come up and participate maybe with me in this question after a few questions maybe. Okay? We have a first question. Where do you start? Something like that. Do you want to ask me anything about the report or do you want to ask me anything about the American cat? Being kidnapped? Okay, well, I'll take one question over here and then I'll get back to that. Yes, sir.
Would you care to opine on how you feel as a society we have done since the issuance of that report? Are we improving?
Mm-hmm.
Are there places that we're going backwards?
Right.
What's your reaction?
Yes, yes. Well, the commission and the members and I had a reunion, a 25th, was it 25th? Let me see, how many years have we got now? Was it 20th or 25th? 83, 93, 100, I guess, yeah. 25th reunion. Amazing. And we all looked a little older. Some of us weren't even there. And so it was very interesting because I was one of the youngest. I think there was the youngest probably on the commission, and because they were all pretty prestigious. And I was on the commission because I was considered the parent representative. And because I had children in kindergarten, elementary school, junior high, and high school at the time. 4 girls happened to be all those ages. And so that I was always deferred to when we talked about the parents, which is why it was appropriate that we put in, nobody was standing up for parents particularly. They were doing science and math and core curriculum and all kinds of things like that. But I just kept saying, you know, who we're educating is children. And so that's why I was able to get in with the help of the other two. It was Governor Quee from Minnesota who was the governor, and the vice chairman of the commission was, vice president was Yvonne Larson from a school in San Diego, one of the biggest schools in the country. And our chairman was David Gardner, a wonderful man. And the reason we were able to get such consensus is because David was such a gentleman and really did listen to all of us. So we asked ourselves at this reunion, well, what do you think it accomplished? Did it accomplish? And we determined that it was not only the right time for the report at that time in history, that people were listening. Remember, we'd passed through the 60s and 70s, and so this was the 80s by that time, and people were looking for some order. They were looking for order in society, and some of them reflecting that unless you have order in your life, an inner order, that there can't be order in society. So many people had retreated from the expressions of violence and such that they had been exhibiting previously, which we all know about, and had kind of sort of retreated a little bit, perhaps, and were looking to enjoy some stability in their lives and in the country. And so we determined, after we went around the table and asking everybody, well, what do you think, that actually things were better, that at least we got a hearing, and at least there were attempts at reforms in public education, which have continued on to this day. Every president has something. Bush had his No Child Left Behind, and it worked or didn't work in certain places and such. But and now, of course, our present president will have his. He's appointed Arne Duncan to the, which is amazing, from Chicago, because he is quite a reformer. And it's sort of ironic that under a more liberal Democratic president that we might actually get some of the reforms that we wanted in our report. And it's because it is a liberal Democratic president that we can even consider some of those, because otherwise the forces that shape education today, that are not only the the teachers' unions and the types of things that the large national organizations, sometimes are not always appreciative of some of the reforms that need to be made, and so that there's a real problem trying to get through some of these changes. But we concluded that yes, things were better, and that we had directed their attention, because education until that time had just sort of gone along. You know, the country schools were there, and everybody just assumed it would be there, and then all of a sudden, we realized, we woke up and said, look what happened to the curriculum. We don't even have a core curriculum anymore. And so that all kinds of things had gotten into the curriculum. I mean, they were, I don't want to offend anybody, so I won't mention any of them. I just was going to mention, then I thought, no, I better not say that. So that, because different people like different things. I mentioned the social stew one to our students that we have at our center, and which are really pretty bright kids and such, and they usually see these things. And one of them said, well, you know, I really liked my social studies class. And so, so then I had to explain what was the problem with sometimes social stew classes, where they may be interesting and fine, and maybe you should have archaeology and anthropology and psychology and all of that in the curriculum, but the problem is if it pushes out history and even geography, which has changed so much. If you look at the textbooks, the geography books, my goodness, what a change in our world have been since maybe if you have a textbook that's 20 years old. I mean, that's really a change, even 10 years old. The way, look at what happened with the fall, the Berlin Wall, and the whole Eastern European countries, how they have changed and continue to change. So you have to keep up with textbooks, and that textbooks are another big problem. But at any rate, we want to get into that because they're so heavy and so big, and they're so controlled often by various textbook committees. So really, the opening up of the internet and the such to the students and posting things so we could read John Adams for this event. We could read him, and we could print out if we wanted to. Take all that paper to print out. We could do that and mark it up and such, you know, on like a textbook, which you're not supposed to because you have to sell it to the next person. And so that this is going to change things considerably. The new technology may actually help us regain some of the things we have lost in the past, because it is now a market where you can choose what it is you want to. You don't have to just strictly stick with what you are taught in a particular class in a particular school. Things are there on the internet and elsewhere, good and bad. For us. So, however, the teacher is still important. Schools are essential, and that they still pave the way for how we're going to think about our society. And I guess the answer is a long way of getting to it, but yes, I do think we have improved. And so I'd like to remain on that optimistic note without qualifying it and nuancing it, which may come up further in the discussion. Okay? Yes?
Could you comment more about your comments about the lack of historical knowledge, losing a cultural basis, that we are losing our common culture in the United States? Because I see that, I teach adults English immigrants and refugees a lot. And under Bush, they proposed a whole new curriculum for the citizenship test, and it kind of fell apart, it seems. The final process and questions don't seem to have changed much. But the idea behind it was trying to teach the philosophy, not just a bunch of statistics, how many stripes in the flag. And I just seemed like it was that same idea that you were mentioning. And I was just like, to comment more on that.
Yes, yes. I think that's essential for classes for immigrants. That they understand that we, the formation of our country was different than other countries. And I think it comes out very well in the Adams reading. I think it explains it so well, where he says that the most striking characteristic of Mr. Adams' mind, his resort to first principles, and that it was based in the English Constitution, and that so much of our revolution was because they were not giving us our rights as Englishmen and as what, under the king at that time. And that we were, under the Constitution, blessed with the same rights and liberties which natural-born subjects in England enjoyed. And that's why Adams was supportive of some of the revolution and such. And so that the other part that I thought in that reading was a wonderful reading. It was the mercantile and manufacturing temper of Great Britain regarded the people of the colonies not as friends and brethren, but as strangers who might be made tributaries. The idea of civil rights was not in question any more than if the country had been conquered by arms. And in a conflict of interests, there was no notion of settling them by compromise or concession. The entire sacrifice was to be made by the Americans. And so that many times people think we were just revolutionary in the same sense as the French Revolution. And we were entirely different. The French Revolution wanted to overturn everything in their society, from the top down to their ideas, their logos, everything. We didn't want to do that. We wanted our rights as Englishmen, and we wanted to be seen that these were given to us by the Constitution, and that it was the King's duty to give them to us. Our relationship was directly to the King, practically, and that is not always taught in American history textbooks. A lot of American history textbooks equate us to the French Revolution. In fact, I was very dismayed to see that Condoleezza Rice went during some celebration of the French Revolution to France, and that she was, encouraging them and thinking, oh yes, we're the same and all that. And I thought, she knows better than that. Why is she pandering? What is she doing? Why would she do that? She was a great representative of our country and what she had acquired and her knowledge and everything. So I really looked up to her, and I was disappointed in that particular thing. But that is why I think it's important who's writing the textbooks, and everything has a sort of an opinion on it, and history is particularly even the writing of how the American history in the Revolution took place. But I think it's absolutely essential that students and immigrants learn that we are a different, and our history and how our laws came about and about the colonists and such, and also the incredible position that the understanding of Christianity at that time had to these people, and that is where they got their mores and their sense of virtue and such from at that point. Now it's argued in schools that we can't teach religion in schools. However, it seems to me disingenuous not to be able to teach at least that the history of the people and the founding and the type of things that they believed. I mean, people today may not feel the same, or they want to be very tolerant and have everybody's religion respected, which we should. But at the same time, it seems just a historic type of thing that we would explain that. And I think that's where we would respect people from immigrants and their religion and such. And in fact, I would think that they would feel a sense of safety, and because we do take that type of thing more serious in this country than they do in Europe. They've just grown up, and it's just kind of there, so that they have neglected their understanding. Until just recently, we actually put a lot of emphasis on our understanding of the virtues and what our founders believed. I don't know if that's any help, but that's just something. Brian, you had a question.
Yeah, can you tell us a little more about the abolition of man, and maybe share 2 or 3 first principles out of that book?
Well, now I'm going to get GLEAVES to come up here and help me a little bit. GLEAVES, do you want to help me with that? This is just the Tao. Well, first of all, I'll try, okay? And then you can help. And that is the Abolition of Man. C.S. Lewis, everybody knows, a Christian apologist and a wonderful writer, short stories for children that explain virtue to them and such. But the ones that I mentioned were the Hebraic Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, the Quran. There's things in the Quran that explain how people should be moral and just and such, and then I think the Tao and such, or the Chinese Tao and such. This was our attempt to be broad, to try to understand that in The Nation at Risk, that we would draw upon these other places too, these other first principles. And so, the first principles, you could just take the 10 Commandments, don't lie, cheat, steal, honor your parents, all of that type of thing. So, I'm not sure what else I could say.
I actually covered it.
Okay.
So,
he's going to be my backup in case I don't cover it. Okay.
No.
Right. Okay. Anything else? You want to hear about my kidnapping?
There's a question back there.
Yes.
John Wood.
Right.
Not to cast an ominous note, but you're in a room of young people who soon, unless they continue to enjoy the Hauenstein thing so well they never leave, I don't know, will be out in our and other communities in leadership positions in the for-profit world, and public service, and so on. I was struck in the article that we were asked to read, written by Russell, a thing here I just flagged, and I'd like you to comment on it. The urgent need of the United States near the end of the 20th century is for a virtue arising from habit and affection rather than from ideological preaching. Without such a renewed true version, our commonwealth may not endure. He goes on to say it's not only for us, but it's for the rest of the world. This is important. Where are we in that process?
The idea of being able to sustain our
Virtue really driving what we do versus
right business as usual. Yeah.
Ideological preaching.
Right. Well, that's always a problem because we are such a politicized country, and it's very difficult, I think, sometimes to get statesmen, politicians to become statesmen, because we are so divided at this point in time between those on one, obviously we can see that every day, on one side of the divide and the other side, and of course a group has come forth now that wants to have both sides talk to each other and that type of thing, which is wonderful, but at the same time there are principles on either side, and so then you have to determine all those, can one compromise on those particular principles, and you know, if someone determines they want a health care policy and someone that it's really good for the people and it's virtuous to have it and we should be doing it, and considers but doesn't consider the economic aspect of it, then, you know, then the opposite is the exact opposite, the person who thinks that this isn't something that we should do. So, I mean, sometimes it's very difficult. How do you have half a policy? Do you see? And when you're talking about policy, I guess what I'm driving at more than particular issues like that, division, is that people should be joined on the idea of truth and justice and understanding of freedom, and should be talking about what those things are, and order. We talk so much in this country about freedom and liberty, but it was always meant from the very beginning by Adams and the founders that it was supposed to be ordered liberty. It wasn't just supposed to be liberty, which could turn into a libertine lifestyle or extreme libertarianism, and so that we were based on the idea that order is the first need of all. Russell wrote a book called The Roots of American Order, which GLEAVES has done some wonderful work on, and in fact he, on this American Cause, when we reissued it, we had him edit the entire book and write the introduction and the conclusion, and this is a book that might answer some of your questions, because it's a small book, so it's not very big, and it's a quick, like more than a pamphlet, but it calls about the need for principles, and it has the moral principles, political principles, and economic principles, the nature of man, ordered liberty, the federal republic, the free economy, that type of thing, and so this might be, you know, something to answer in a much larger way, something that I can't really answer right now, but that might help. And also his other book called The Roots of American Order, which I'm going to have, because GLEAVES is so expert in this and knows it so well and can explain it. Would you explain what the roots of American order are?
We're all going to be here till 10 o'clock tonight. Very briefly, the roots of American order is the very idea that Annette said at the very beginning about how we stand on the shoulders of giants. That the founders themselves looked to Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, and the medieval traditions out of London to formulate their ideas of what an ordered and just polity would look like. This is why they were so well read. If you look at the debates, if you look at even the letter exchanges among the founders, they actually wrote to each other in Greek. They actually were fluent in Latin. Any serious historian who wants to deal with the founders has to be able to read a little Greek and Latin to get through the letters. They would misquote a little bit, but that shows all the more the authenticity of their knowledge. And they would take a Cicero or a Plato, and they would say, what is it? Is there something that applies in all cultures, at all times? This is the idea at the end of C.S. Lewis's book, of course, The Abolition of Man, this wonderful appendix, because you can find passages right alongside Cicero will be Confucius. Right alongside the Quran will be the Old Testament. And there's this natural philosophy that has arisen out of what Russell often called the wisdom of the species, the experience, the accumulated experience. And if we abide by the first principles that are derived from Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, London, and from what C.S. Lewis called this great patrimony, this cross-cultural, multicultural, if we abide by that, our culture will never get too far adrift from the just and ordered freedom to which we all aspire. Go too far from these and we're in deep trouble. This is basically the thesis on
Too
that.
far from that, and we turned into what Russell called decadence. Decadence he defined as the loss of an object, when you don't know where you're going. And so people become decadent by not giving attention to where we should be going. And that's why what we were trying with the report was to bring people back to the understanding of first principles, that there needed to be something, an order, an inner order in the souls of the citizens in order for them to display that as an outer order in society. And it needed those understandings need to be transmitted from one generation to the other. And the order that GLEAVES is talking about and you can correct me, but I think it's important to understand that the order is that the first, in Jerusalem, what did we get from Jerusalem? We got the understanding that there was one God. There were many gods at that time, pagan gods and such, but they came together, the Old Testament and the New Testament, one God, that there was a one God. So that the understanding of our country has been that there's a transcendent order that to which we must adhere. And so that's like one of the first principles that was just assumed, that there was a transcendent order, no matter what you call that God, that there was a one God. And then from Athens, and we got the understanding of democracy, and where it worked and didn't work, and what it could do and couldn't do, and then the philosophy, and then from Rome, the understanding of virtue, history, citizenship, and then from the London, the Magna Carta, the understanding of parliamentary system of government. And then all of that contributed to our Constitution and our original founding, because our founders were classically trained, and they knew all of those things. Now, the students in our country today, you know, we're not classically trained, and we don't even have that type of thing, and there's so much modern stuff to do that we can't, and we just kind of, oh, that's ancient history, you see. And so that that was what went into our roots of order. So that's, anything else? Mandy? All right. What happened was I was driving home from Lansing, having attended a bicentennial gathering there for Russell, because he was on the state committee, and I couldn't make it, and so I went in his place. And as I was coming home, I saw a young woman on the side of the road, and she was hitchhiking. This is back in '75, you know, a long time ago. And so that I thought, oh, that poor girl, it's raining and such, so I shouldn't pick her up, whatever. And so you play games with your mind, and so I said, well, I'll go around the block, and if she's still there, I'm supposed to pick her up. Okay, so of course she was still there. And so I did pick her up, and as soon as she got in the car, I was a little sorry that I had picked her up, because she was sniffing glue. And so here she was, and I thought, oh, great. So I opened my window, and she was a runaway, and she was telling me that she was going to go home and take care of some business for her daddy, because her brother and her daddy were fighting, and she was going to take care of it. And so I didn't know what that all meant, but I knew it wasn't good. And so that she said, I want to go to Pompeii, Michigan. And so I didn't even know where that was. And so that, but I was driving from Lansing, and it is on the way, but you have to go over quite a bit west to get there. And so listening to her, I realized I better let her out as soon as I can. And so that, because she started thinking about taking me to Pompeii, and that my daddy's going to like you. And so I thought, oh, great. You know? And so that I decided that I better, you know, kind of leave her off. And so I said to her, I said, well, you know, I have to go straight, and my children are waiting for me to get home and such, so I can't really go off that way. So I'll let you off right here on the road, and you can catch another ride going that way. I'm going to Pompeii, and you driving me. And so she pulled up her shirt, and there was a pistol in her pants, actually, you know, and jeans. And so that I thought, so trying to keep my cool, I just I said, I guess I can go to Pompeii. So we went to Pompeii. And so right away, of course, when you're in a situation like this, you have to think, what next? What am I going to do? Okay, plan A. I'm going to, as soon as I drive into that town, I'm going to go to a gas station, and I will tell her I need to get some gas, and she won't suspect anything, because all the way then after I determined that I was going to have to be with her a while, I kept stroking her arm and saying, you poor kid, you've had a rough life, and that type of thing. So she was getting dizzy, woozier with this type of thing, and so I thought, well, it shouldn't be a problem when I get there, because I can open the door and I'll kind of push her out and everything. And so that, but meanwhile, I was thinking that I would stop at I didn't want to go to the house where the father was, and so that I was going to stop at the gas station. Well, I pulled into Pompeii, and if anybody knows that little place, there is no gas station. Is it? Well, actually there is, but it's closed. It's a kind of thing that has a roof like this with cobwebs coming, on. It was just closed like probably 50 years ago. And so I thought, oh, that's not going to work, because I was going to jump out of the car and run into the gas station and tell the man to call the police and lock the door, whatever. And so plan B, how to go to plan B, what to do next. And so we're driving out into the country, and the problem was there were big ditches on either side of the road, so you couldn't even really turn around. So I was worried about that. And but finally we did get to the house where the father was going to be, and as we pulled up, as I say, I was stroking her arm and such, and she was pretty woozy by now. And so I said, here we are, I'll come see you, Daddy, next time, I promise. And so I opened the door, and I said, I'll come around and get you. Now, come on, you step out there. And so she stepped out, and I pulled that door closed fast and took off down the road, not knowing if I was going into a dead end or not, because, it's out in the countryside, and is that mine? You can shut it off if you want. I completely forgot about my cell phone. How embarrassing. And so that there I just took off, and I did find that the road went on, thank goodness. And so I got home, and I called Russell, and he was teaching at Hillsdale, I think, at that time. And I called him, he was in his office, and I said, Russell, guess what happened? And I told him the whole story, and he said, oh, that's a great story. And I said, I'm alive. I mean, it's fine. And here you are telling oh, yes, of course, I'm so happy you're alive. Oh, it's great. It's a great story. And so that he had a kind of mind where he could remember things instantly. And so that he then did remember that and wrote a story. And the story is, I'm trying to think now the name of it. It's about my kidnapping, and but of course he took lots of poetic license and told more things and exaggerated things and such. It was very interesting. But it's called. Let me see. It's about the girl who gets kidnapped, and the Princess of All Lands. Yes. The Princess of All Lands. That's what it's called. And so he wrote that and many other short stories too. So that and they all had some basis. So it's great fun living with a storyteller, because you can see where he got the ideas from and the incidents and such, and you can put it together and say, oh, I remember that, or whatever. So it was very interesting. Okay, thank you very much. Here.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Grand Valley State University. Visit us at gvsu.edu.